Mr. Dean Houdeshell, thank you very much for joining me on the Refinery Podcast, and all the way from Iowa. Welcome. Good to see you.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.
Yeah. Okay. So Iowa, is that your native state? Did you grow up there? Where did you
Yeah, I
grow
grew
up?
up in Iowa. It's interesting. I grew up in Iowa, and then work took me away for about 30 years, and then about 5 years ago, moved me back here to my hometown to be around mom.
Very nice. Very nice. So the 30 years, where were you away? I'm just curious about
Yeah, I
where
was
that
up in
was.
Northwest Iowa. I was down in near Kansas City, Missouri. I was
Yeah.
out in Roanoke, Virginia,
Yep.
and then I was in the Des Moines area for about 12 years before
Yeah.
moving back to Cedar Rapids.
Very nice. Very nice. Well, you weren't too far from my growing up. I'm a Kansas boy. I grew
Okay,
up in
yeah.
Emporia, Kansas. So yeah, very good. Very good. So I got a great affinity for Iowa as well. Spent a lot of days in Iowa in my college years because we were wrestling at schools in Iowa when we would go to
Yeah,
tournaments. So
absolutely.
yeah, absolutely. Well, hey, so talk about just kind of your personal professional background, whatever you want to share. I mean, we kind of said where you went, but just kind of for the purpose of people getting to know you and a little bit about your story. Tell us about that.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I I spent 30 years as an engineer, mechanical engineer, graduate from the University of Iowa,
Hmm.
and my first job was really an interesting job up in Northwest Iowa, where I was the only mechanical engineer, and so I
Hmm.
had a lot of hats that I wore.
Yeah.
But I would say probably half my time I was working on prototypes, and the other half I was troubleshooting stuff on the plant floor, which was just interesting, just because I got a lot of good experience, connection with the plant floor
Hmm.
and just troubleshooting in general.
Yeah.
But probably
And
the
what
biggest
was
thing my go
so
ahead.
sorry, what was what industry was that? What industry were you in
That
that?
was in the aerial device, so building sigil lifts and personnel lifts. Yeah.
Oh, nice, nice. So would that when you did those, what would be like the size of those? Because we see a lot of those, and they come in like different shapes and sizes. Where they have just all sizes that you guys were
Yeah,
building.
typically, anywhere from 20 up to 40 foot
Yeah,
was probably what we did for the most part. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. Nice. So where did you go from doing that and being the mechanical engineer at that
Yeah, from
company?
there, I think I went to one of the companies that really changed my career trajectory. I worked for Altec Industries making utility trucks
Okay.
in actually in St. Joe, Missouri, so just north of Kansas City.
Yes.
And what an incredible organization! Their values, they lived out their values, which was very important to me.
That's great.
And one of those was people are your greatest strength.
Hmm.
And it became something. It became a part of my career because I became a person that developed people. So
Yeah.
anybody that was on my team, my goal was to develop them, and they spent time developing their people, their engineers. But I had a chance to move out to Virginia. My
Hmm.
boss, it was funny story. My boss pulled me in his office and he said, "Hey, I'm moving out to Virginia to start up a plant for the company." And without missing a beat, I said, "When do I pack my bags?"
Yeah.
And so there I am, on a team of 5 people that went out to Roanoke, Virginia to start up
Yeah.
a plant.
Yeah.
And that was pretty amazing because, again, I'm in a situation where I'm the only engineer. There's 5 of us in the office and 10
Hmm.
in the plant that we hired.
Yeah.
And we grew that to 250 employees and multiple millions. I probably can't, I don't know if I can say technically how much revenue we made, but
Sure.
it's significant in the millions of
Right. Yeah.
dollars of revenue.
Yeah. Well, that would make sense. And Roanoke's a beautiful place too. So you
That was
kind of in the
gorgeous.
mountains
Yeah,
there. It's a
yeah,
great place to be. Yeah. Near the Appalachian Trail right there.
yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Excellent. So yeah, that's an interesting dynamic because, um, I'm curious about like the moment at which I know that Altec as a company, you said, is all about the people. But in terms of, if you're going to be a mechanical engineer, you've got a mechanical mind, you've got an engineering mind, which typically is not a people focused mindset, right? And that
Yeah.
orientation, right? I'm curious for you, like when did the value of the people really become important to you? When did you first sort of noticing, hey, this is more than like, making all the parts work together? Talk about that. I'm curious
Yeah,
about that
right,
journey
right.
for
So
you.
I think that was in the plant startup was really where that came to light. is as we were building the team, right? I'm building an engineering team, we're building a manufacturing team.
Hmm.
And one of the things I got into was I was doing training around hydraulics.
Yeah.
And so I do a class. We did about a 12-week class, and I just remember vividly walking out to the plant floor one time, after the class, and one of the supervisors said, "Hey, Dean, come over here." And I come over, and he's like, "Hey, we had this problem, and this wasn't working, and this was here, and this and that." And he's like, "And we solved the problem." And it was suddenly this light that went off in my head is as I build and I develop people, right? I didn't have to be there to solve the problem. See, before they would have called me and had me come out to work on that problem. But now that I had equipped them with the tools they needed, they had a lot more pride in what they were doing because now they understood rather than, connecting hose A to B to this, they understood how the system worked and so they could troubleshoot it. So I think it was an all around win win, but really that was where it solidified to me is if you build your people right, you're gonna get a lot out of it.
Nice. Yeah. I love that because it's kind of like, you become the sun of the solar system, but then you help everybody become their own sun, right? They can all,
Yeah.
I love that. Really good.
Yeah, and
Um,
I remember as well, I mean, I get called, and it was a large, but it was about 170,000 square foot plant, and it was
mhm.
probably like walking a football field out to the
Yeah.
production line at first, because
Yeah.
we built the plant and then we grew into it,
Yeah.
and they would call me, and I'd walk out there and back, and eventually I had a list of questions, right, and
Hmm.
so they'd call me, and I would just run through my list, and eventually, right, they would call me, and just like anybody that as you start to train them like that, they're like, hey, we've already done this, this, and this, right? So
Yeah.
again, being able to maximize my time in
Sure.
doing the things, and I talk about that from a leadership perspective as well,
Hmm.
is I could empower them to do that troubleshooting, right? And
Yes.
then I could work on other higher level things.
Yeah. Yeah. That's so key. In fact, just today I was in a coaching conversation with these same dynamics playing out is, how do you take all of this knowledge and ability that you possess and pass that along to other people in a way that you don't have to be the full possessor of all of this and everyone
Right.
else can. Yeah. And
Yeah.
sometimes there are things that of course you need to be the one to hold on to, or you're the
Sure.
one that has the unique expertise, but not all the time. And probably a lot less often than we expect. Right.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Um, yeah. So how did things sort of move forward from you and being in those industries and being in that engineering and then the people facing in the engineering world and how did that kind of go towards what you do today?
Yeah, so I think that really helped me to, I mean, again, see the value in developing people and teams. I think I really enjoyed the training side of it. Really
Hmm.
being able to see that light go off. I mean, if you've
Yeah.
ever been in that training room and you're doing the training and suddenly somebody gets it, it's
Yes.
just an incredible feeling.
Yes.
And so we had about four kids along the way, and it was just getting difficult to go back to see grandparents back here in Iowa. And my wife's from Oklahoma,
Uh-huh.
and so I decided to make a change, and we moved back to Ankeny, Iowa, just outside of Des Moines.
Hmm.
And I started working for a company that did hydraulics and did a lot of training. But I was an application engineer on the sales team, and it was really interesting for me to again be in a leadership role and take a step back. Right, there was a little less pressure, but it was just a good time just to reflect on kind of those years a little bit. But the beautiful thing was I was able to work with multiple companies and developing prototypes, working with them on identifying components, working on systems, which again was something that from an engineering perspective, you're always wanting, you love to build.
Yes. Yeah.
And so that was just a great time there to get that experience. But I think one of the things that taught me there was around problem solving and
Hmm.
being data driven and problem solving. A lot of
Yes.
times when people talk about problems, they talk in generalities.
Hmm.
And it was always about getting back to, okay, what's the data say, right? We always
Yeah.
talk about what's the data say? Because without data, you really sometimes don't know what's going on. And many times you don't know what's going on.
Yeah. And most people are relying on their emotions and how they feel in that moment, right?
Right,
Yeah.
right.
Yeah.
It's like
Yeah.
this happens all the time, right? Okay, well, what
Yes.
does that mean? How many customers, how many units, how many, customers, where are they located at? You start to do that. And that was a really just a neat experience there. But again, I kind of moved up in leadership roles there and enjoyed again leading a team. of engineers there. But I really wanted an opportunity to kind of lead an engineering team that had design control.
Okay.
And so that's when I made a shift, and I moved to a small manufacturing company that made volumetric concrete mixers.
Okay.
And when I walked through the interview, it was quite the experience. It was torrential rain, and there was like holes in the roof and water dropping down, and I've had these experiences where I've been like with really, really good and manufacturing plants that were run really well,
Right.
right? And not that it wasn't run well, but you could just see there was just low hanging fruit.
Right.
And so the leadership team there, they were looking for a new director of engineering, and so I moved into that role,
Hmm.
and that ended up being a turnaround.
Yeah.
And so we grew that business. We doubled the revenue in that business in just over 4 years.
Nice.
And what I loved about that was just being able to get to work with a team and be able to solve problems. So one of the things we used a system out there called Traction or EOS.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
And it's just a way of systematizing your business. And one
Yep.
of the key things that was that I learned there was asking the question, what's working, what's not working.
Yes.
And then as a team, right, I drove the concept down into my team is asking the team, what's working, what's not working for you,
Hmm.
right? And so we would flush out things that, when you many times when you go in, it's like, we've always done it this way, right? I
Yeah.
ask a question, we've always done it this way. And for me, I learned that if an engineer says that, and it's probably a lot of people, but engineers in particular, it means we don't know why we do it that way.
Yes.
And so I would often ask, okay, well, let's figure out why, because that's really what's holding us back from making a change or making an improvement, is because we're afraid we're gonna mess something up. And so we did that. We did that multiple times. It was also an opportunity. I was always an engineer that I was very hands-on,
Hmm.
and I would just get involved. And I remember a couple instances there where there were a couple challenges, and one in particular, I was like, I know it's the right answer, and they kept challenging, and just because of my experience, and I don't think they'd ever had an engineer do this. I went out, I crawled underneath the truck, and I installed the PTO that they said couldn't be installed, right?
Right. Right.
And then another occasion, right, they were having a problem with one of the bins, and I climbed inside the bin, and the guy on the plant floor was shocked because he'd been there for quite a few years, and he'd never seen an engineer climb inside the bin.
Right.
I'm like, well, it just didn't hold me back, right?
Yeah. Right.
And so really building connection there was really key. And I think part of that job as well was really, I've always been somebody that kind of breaks down departmental barriers. So
Uh-huh.
being able to cross that departmental barrier and not, sometimes businesses can get very siloed, right?
Yes.
And I always try to make connections across because you need to be able to build those relationships so that you can work collaboratively to make positive change.
Yeah, and
And
it's really interesting because if you keep doing what you've always done, you'll keep getting what you've always gotten, right? And I appreciate the
right,
way that you're really digging down. We're not looking at the fruit, we're looking at the roots to go.
right,
And that also what I hear in what you're saying is interesting because this concept of siloing, people forget that we're all doing one thing.
right,
Right. We think we're
right.
doing this thing and you're doing that thing, but we're all doing one thing. We just we're not looking up high enough, right, to what
Yeah,
that thing is. And I like how you did, you gotta link all that together. Right.
yeah, and,
Yeah.
and, and, and especially I think with my teams, one of the things, right, was being able to empower them. I think again from Altec to the rest of my career had been, learning to invest in people, but then empowering them, right?
Uh-huh.
Many times the leader becomes the decision bottleneck
Yeah.
because all the decisions have to go through him. And that was sort of the opposite of what I tried to do. I tried to build up the people so that I had really smart people working for me, right?
Hmm.
I didn't have to be the smartest person in the room,
Right.
um, so that I could empower them to solve problems. And so I would give them sort of, here's your decision making sandbox, right?
Yep.
So if it impacts engineering and engineering only, then let's talk about it and we'll decide which project we work on. If it goes outside of that box, if it goes across the departmental boundaries, then we just have to have more communication. We have to communicate with other departments and see, is what we're doing, is that creating a bottleneck in the business, or is it going to be beneficial?
What would you say if you were kind of like, I love that idea of like giving them the sandbox or almost like a toolbox, right? Like you get,
Right.
if it's a toolbox, sandbox, whatever, what were the essential elements of that you're giving them? I mean, I can kind of think of one particular thing, but um, like for me, for example, when I hear you say that, what comes to my mind is one thing that had to be essential in that is they have to learn to ask the right questions, right? And then you were kind of saying that before of like, why are we doing this? What's the point of all this? And just going back and looking at the data and what is it telling us? What do you think what are some of the tools when you're in this process of empowering people and helping them to, be able to execute on things in a way that gets rid of all these bottlenecks? What are some of the essential elements of that for you?
Yeah, that's a great question. I would say a piece of it, and I sometimes talk about it as decision boundaries as well, right? Is what do those
Mm-hmm.
boundaries look like? And I think, part of me is again, what's working, what's not working was a really good tool for
Uh-huh.
us to use because we
Uh-huh.
could really flesh it out. But then I think one of the things early on that I think I missed was getting to what's the return on investment,
Yeah.
right? And making sure that the change isn't just something that is a nice to have; it's something
Uh-huh.
that we need to have. But
Uh-huh.
I think a part of it came from as you take a look at the organization, and as your purpose, vision, and goals flow down, is does
Uh-huh.
this support the goals of the company, right?
Yeah.
And so many times what we were working on were things to make us more efficient from an engineering perspective so that we could achieve those goals that we were being asked.
Mm.
And I think one of the things I often share with my team was my brother was a commander of a submarine. He was in the
Uh-huh.
Navy for 34 years.
Uh-huh.
And I love what he told me one time. He says, my job is to get the submarine ready to do whatever the president asks us to do,
Mm.
right?
Yeah.
And it was just beautiful because I thought that was my role as a director of engineering, right?
Uh-huh.
Is to get my team prepared to do whatever the organization needs us to do.
Yeah. Yeah.
And sometimes that it was very very cut and dried, like good process. But every once in a while, you get thrown a curveball, and it's
Uh-huh.
how do you manage with that, right? And deal with sort of those shifting priorities.
Yeah.
And I think the system that we had sort of led into that. And ideally having something like 3 to 5 goals per year as an organization, particularly a small business, medium sized
Uh-huh.
business, was something that really helped us to be able to make some major improvements.
Yeah. Yeah. So let's think about like your career moving forward and just kind of what led you to the business that you're doing now. How did those transitions go for you and what was going on?
Yeah, I joined the John Maxwell team in 2018 and became a certified speaker trainer coach.
Uh-huh.
And I'd always, I had a boss that asked me, we're kind of hanging out, and he's like, "What do you want?" And I was like, What do you mean, what do I want?" And he's like, "Well, what do you want?" And I was like, "Well, I think I'm doing what I want." But he's like, "What do you want?" And I kind of lost myself in my career to a certain extent, and I think
Right.
we can do that because we get so involved and we get so busy with that, right? And then you have family life and everything else.
Mm.
And I always thought that I wanted to be a motivational speaker,
Uh-huh.
or also own a marketing company, which somewhere that fits in there. I love the audio visual side of the
Yeah.
creative space of that.
Right.
And so I joined John Maxwell and I started learning those principles. I learned just some things, but I started using my team as sort of my laboratory.
Uh-huh.
Then I got involved with a group called the Empowered Living Group, and
Uh-huh.
again, learning some more principles. And my executive coach was telling me, hey, as long as you're in the corporate world, just use that as your laboratory and continue to test. And so I was developing and growing my people through that.
Yeah.
But I got to a point where I thought, well, have I done as much as I can, and could I have a bigger impact if I was outside of an organization? And
Uh-huh.
so that was a decision point I came to a couple of years ago, and finally decided just to launch my business, doing business consulting, leadership training, and that kind of a thing.
Yeah. And so what would have been the year that you really kind of made that leap for that?
Yeah, 2024 is when I left full time job.
Uh-huh.
It's one of those fun experiences. I say fun with
Yeah.
quotation marks, right?
Right.
Is 30 years of having a paycheck every 2 weeks, and then suddenly you're out, you know, looking for work every week. It seems like sometimes.
Yeah. Yep. Yep. Yeah. Yeah. So what is the name of your company today?
Yeah, Innovative Coaching Strategies is my
Hmm.
company
Hmm.
today, and that came out of really my one of my passions is creativity and innovation.
Hmm.
Because I believe everybody's creative, and
Yeah.
I believe in unlocking that creativity in everyone.
Hmm. Hmm.
But I think creativity is as I define it, is stepping beyond what's familiar,
Hmm.
and it's really having that idea or whatever that is. But really, innovation for me is then how do you take that idea or that new thing, and how do you bring it into reality?
Yeah. Yeah. So who would you say and are you now working with companies similar to the ones you used to work for, or what are some of your clientele today?
Yeah, I work with a wide range of companies. I work with manufacturing, engineering, tech services.
Hmm.
I'm doing some stuff with trades.
Hmm.
I think of it as a sort of a business strategist.
Hmm. Hmm.
I'm a strategic business builder is sometimes what I refer to myself as. From doing strategic planning to actually maybe working with a team and developing leaders. I think one of the things that I think is important, at least from what I saw, is most companies overlook the potential that they have in the organization. Many
Mm.
times they're looking to grow the top line,
Right.
but if they would tap into the organization and their people, they could really take a look at that cost, what's driving the costs,
Hmm.
and be able to gain some efficiencies. And so for me, as we take a look at the world today, as it's changing, AI is rapidly changing. I think that they say that every day the world keeps moving faster and faster,
Right.
and I talk about how organizations can no longer rely on a select few to be
Hmm.
creative and innovative,
Right.
and being able to activate that within the organization, within a framework. All right, because I think one of the things I talk about is structure without imagination is rigid, and
Hmm.
imagination without structure is chaos. Right, and
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
innovation sort of lies in between the two.
Yeah. So how do you, from a cultural standpoint of a business, if we're talking about a business that has 10 plus people there, what do you typically see needs to change, or what do they have to take on board in order to be more innovative and in order
Yeah.
to be in that sweet spot between structure and creativity and
Yeah, I think the biggest piece of it, I think it's for any organization. I think small organizations in particular fall susceptible as they grow so fast that their processes don't stay up to date. And
mm,
so I think really having a structure, what is that organizational structure like? What's the vision look like? So I work
yeah.
a lot with companies on identifying the vision, the
Hmm.
purpose and the vision, right? And then thinking through what are the goals, what are the things we need to do in the next 90, 180 or 365 days to
Hmm.
be able to begin to build that vision. So I think that's where it starts. And then
Hmm.
I think with anything, one of the things I learned as well, Patrick Lencioni has a book out there called The Five Dysfunctions of the Team. And,
Yeah.
and
Hmm.
the foundation, right, is trust.
Yeah.
And so how do you build that trust? And so for me as a leader, that's one of the things when I go in, and I got to the point at the end of my career was I would be very honest and open, and I'm like, I don't know all the answers, and I'm not going to know all the answers, right?
Yeah.
And that goes a long way, being transparent and building that trust within the team and within the organization.
Yeah. That's really, really very good. And what do you think? Um, it sounds like what you're a lot of, if I could put a word on kind of one thing I see as an outcome of businesses and companies working with you is it gives them a better opportunity to be nimble, to be more nimble
Yeah.
in a rapidly changing marketplace. What else do you think is important for businesses today to understand, just in terms of when you look at your perspective across different industries? You see that, you mentioned the change in technology. What do you think businesses should be keeping their eye on today?
I think one of the things I see often right now, I think with small business, one is succession planning is how am I developing the next generation or the next leader to take over the company.
Hmm.
But I think in any organization, I think there's a gap right now. There's a lot of people that are retiring, and one of the things is how do I build the leadership and infrastructure I need to continue to grow the company.
Yeah.
And so I think those are some things to keep an eye on in particular. Um, is how do I develop those leaders internally, right? Because
Yeah.
there's less and less people out there to be able to tap into. And the beautiful thing was like 25 years ago, I went through some leadership training, and it was it was company specific. It was with Altec, and they really had a system for developing leadership,
Hmm.
right? So they'd come in for 3 days and they would teach you, this is leadership, this is how we do leadership.
Hmm.
And so it was, multidiscipline, so across department people that came in there. And so you were building relationships, but you're also learning a common language for leadership
Yeah.
and then developing leaders. And so I think that's an important thing, I think, for companies to think about, right, as well as just because I hire somebody from another company that was a manager doesn't mean that they're a good leader. I hopefully
Right.
vetted them well enough, right? But how do I bring them in and help them understand how we as an organization um, lead our people?
So, what would you say, in your experience working with companies, where are their biggest hesitations or where are their biggest blind spots in terms of being more innovative, in terms of being more nimble? What do you, what do you find that, what do you find that they find challenging in all this process of empowering their team and helping their team to, developing the leaders from within their company?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think it's a little bit across the board. I think um, for some companies it's when do I start, right? Particularly for small business, when do I start
Hmm.
doing that? And I don't think it's too early to start at any time. I
Hmm.
think having that in mind from the beginning is good. I think some of the change management is how do I handle this, right?
Hmm.
Particularly, I think a lot of the companies that I worked for were engineering centric. So
Yes.
they were started off as small companies, engineering centric, but as they grew, right, decision making became decentralized,
Hmm.
right?
Hmm.
And there was always this gap between, okay, well, engineering used to make all these decisions, as now supply chain, now customer service are making decisions, and so that becomes the challenge, from a cultural standpoint, is how do
Hmm.
you how do you train and empower people? And again, what I saw work well is is in particular is developing people and getting them a well-rounded experience.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, and so that it's just like my brother went in enlisted in the Navy, right?
Hmm.
And he worked his way up to the captain of sub, right? He
Hmm.
knew everything from the ground floor all the way up, right? Same kind of thing with me when I started in a plant startup, right? I was out there putting PTOs on, stocking shelves, cleaning the bathrooms once a month, whatever it was, right? Is you start to have that lived experience. So I think sometimes what happens, the trap what I see in organizations is they get so busy in the business, right?
Hmm.
That they're doing so much and they're trying to produce so much more, but they've got inefficient processes. And so I think that can be the challenge sometimes, is saying, well, hey, let's take a time out. If we spent, you know, 2 hours a week, or we spent, half a day a week working on, whatever our biggest challenge is, right? How much is that going to benefit us down the road, because we're going to be that much more efficient? Maybe we'd be better off investing that time, and many times they are investing that time in working on the business rather than being in the business.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's really the value, isn't it? It's interesting. I was just in a coaching conversation today, and at the end of the conversation, somebody in the hall said, I don't think we would have ever come up with some of those ideas before. And I said, yes, but that's the value of pausing, right? Of
Yeah,
just pausing to think into it, is that it's not really about whether I said something or, it's just the value of the process itself, right?
right.
Yeah.
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 Well, and I, th-
Yeah.
I think the other thing is the challenge becomes groupthink, right?
Yeah.
Is you haven't had somebody come in and take a look, and even have a strategic conversation about what's going on in your business with somebody outside of the business, right?
Hmm.
You could fall into the fact that you're just doing things because you're all now thinking the same. and you're not thinking outside the box. It's like when I took over the engineering team and the turnaround, right? The engineers had never left the four walls,
Mm.
right?
Yeah.
One of
Yeah.
the first things I
Yeah.
did was I tried to find, well, how can I get them outside these four walls to see what's
Yeah.
outside in the outside world?
Yeah. And you said a really key word for that whole thing a little bit ago is that the concept of trust. Like if I'm going to get out of groupthink, I have to know that's a safe thing to do.
Exactly. Right.
Right. I
Yeah.
mean, it's easy to understand kind of how we get into that, but one dynamic of that is we do that because there's safety in numbers, right?
Yes. Right.
And yeah, you don't rock the boat, but when you make it okay for the boat to be rocked, then, that's a safe thing to do. That's good
Yeah.
for everyone,
Yeah, that
right?
brings up a thought as well. I think from a leadership perspective, that was one of the things that I had to learn was as I empowered my people is to give them the space to fail, right?
Yeah.
And still understand that I'm responsible.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's a hard thing for a leader because, that's why they end up sometimes making the decisions is because I want it to be my decision, right?
Mm-hmm.
And when somebody else's decision, right? They may make a decision that I don't agree with.
Mm-hmm.
But for me, the thing was building the team to the point that I was transparent enough to where they understood, how I thought, the things we had good communication. But again, it gets back to building that trust so that I could trust them enough to make the right decision and know that they're not going to always make the right decision.
Yeah.
But that becomes a learning point, right?
Yeah. And it's not fatal, right? And I think there's a key in there. It's not fatal, but also that we have to have a commitment to growth and learning when we do that as well, right?
Right.
I think some of the healthiest companies I've worked with, one thing is that they're not asking people to be perfect. In other words, your failure isn't fatal. And there's another
Yes.
part of that. We don't make the same mistake twice kind of culture, right? Because
Right.
sometimes some of the companies, like the mistakes we're making, there's a lot of zeros behind those mistakes. So,
Right.
we can't keep absorbing this kind of mistake, but we can give at least some latitude for for people to do. And I think part of that is we're not all just trying to pass the blame here. And I think there's also a commitment to your customers or your clients that you have to make of quality. In other words, hey, if we screw this up, we're going to get it right. And that's a hard deal.
Right.
That there's a, not everyone will allow themselves to think that way because they're so worried about like whether they're going to win or lose on the money
Right.
front, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. The thing I think about that, I mean, it brings in mind is really developing a culture of ownership. I think
Mm-hmm.
that was for me another thing from the plant startup, right? That I learned was just like if I didn't get my job done, the guys in the
Mm-hmm.
plant floor wouldn't have work and they wouldn't be able to pay their bills.
Yeah.
Right? And so there was a
Mm-hmm.
certain ownership for me through that process that I own the work that I do. And I think that's an important thing, right, for organizations is create this culture of ownership. And so even if you fail, right,
Mm-hmm.
it's how do you come together and solve the problem? And trust me, I've made plenty of mistakes over my career, right?
Mm-hmm.
And some of them, I just beat my head. But the beautiful part of that was the team coming together, and not just my team, but my peers coming together and figuring out, hey, let's figure out how to solve this,
Yeah.
right? And obviously always feel horrible about it,
Mm-hmm.
particularly in the moment. But
Mm-hmm.
like you say, don't make fatal decisions. And I think part of that becomes giving people that safe space, but the ability to come and ask questions. And I always tell my people, hey, if you've got a question and you're unsure about something, let's have a conversation before it. But for me, I would always use that as a teaching moment, right? One of the
Yes.
principles I was taught early on was like, don't bring a problem to your leader, bring the problem with 3 solutions,
Yeah. Very
right?
good.
And a
Yeah.
recommendation.
Yeah. Yeah. Good. And they don't have to be the right ones. Just put some thought into it, right? We'll
Yeah,
figure it
yeah.
out. Yeah. Yeah. I love that. I love that. So I'm going to use this word. What's on your horizon? What do you got cooking, right now? What have you been working on? What's new for you? What for you kind of coming in as a business consultant, as a strategist? What's important to you right now that you're bringing to your clients or potential clients?
Yeah. Thanks. Horizon's a great word. I've been working on this thing called the Project Horizon, and I think of it as the infinite horizon model, right? So we're always looking like we can always be better, right?
Hmm.
And looking out there in the future is what's coming at us next. But from my perspective, this Project Horizon really is around creativity and innovation. But I think before you get to the creativity and innovation, is it's developing problem solving capability and decision making. Right.
Hmm.
So we've talked a lot about this.
Yeah.
Is around how do we solve how do we teach people how to solve problems
Hmm.
and then empower them to solve them, and then how do they have that, how do they, are they able to make that decision, right?
Yeah.
So what are
Yeah.
those decision boundaries? So one of the things I like to do is come and work with teams, is talk about, hey, here's some problem solving methods. How are you doing it? What's the sort of the way that the organization looks at that. But then how do you set up that boundary? So as a leadership team, what are the boundaries that each leader can have as far as the decisions they're making? So creating up sort of that sandbox that their teams can play in,
Hmm.
so that again, you create that safe space for them to be able to play in.
Yeah, and the beauty of this is the consequence of these things. In other words, the return on investment that can happen. You mentioned in the particular plant that you went to, and doubled and tripled the profit, and because you allowed for these things, you allowed for better problem solving and decision making, and to dig into why do we do it this way? What is the data telling us? And that all of this has a consequence. It's not purely for the sake of problem solving or purely for the sake of decision making or even creativity or innovation, right? It's that we can increase our returns on these, right?
Right. Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think that's the other key piece of it as well, is making sure that the things that you're doing are giving a return on investment. Obviously, the company's investing you know in the organization, right? And
Hmm.
so making sure that you're giving back a return on that investment, right?
Yeah.
And I think the great thing is my executive coach, Mr. Martinelli, he talks about the return of investment
Hmm.
and the return on investment. So like,
Mm.
you know, if you at least get your return of investment right, your people have probably grown along the way. At least I would hope they have. But the
Hmm.
goal would be to get that return on investment.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's multiplying it instead of adding it,
Yeah,
right? Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, good thoughts. Well, what else? What else would have we not talked about, or what's a question maybe I should have asked you that I didn't ask you today that we should
Um,
consider?
that is a really good question. I think the one thing that I was thinking about was, um, when there's a challenge or when there's a problem. I don't always like to use the problem. I use like challenge or opportunity,
Sure. Hmm.
sort of brand it that way. Um, it's usually the person that's dealing with it knows the most about it,
Yeah.
right? Because they're coming in dealing with it every day. And I talk about this, is like particularly for the CEO or the business owner, is I'm sure if I asked you right now, there's one thing that that if you could fix it, you'd have an idea of what that was. And
Hmm.
I tell them, I'll guarantee you that everybody that walks through the doors has ideas too, and they think about them every day,
Yeah.
right? And that's this idea that for me with my engineering teams, and I think it can be broader than that, is we would partner. I taught my teams to partner with the people in the manufacturing floor, partner with the
Mm.
people that are having the problem,
Yep.
because many times they know what they've been thinking about as a solution, and it can be a seed for the true solution. It could be the solution.
Yeah.
Hey, let's just give it a try, right?
Hmm.
Um,
Yeah.
and many times they knew, and just with a little bit of engineering help or a little bit of support, but you
Yeah.
could solve that problem. And so I think that's another thing to keep in mind, right? Is there's no lack of ideas. I think the biggest lack is the lack of a system to put those ideas into action.
Yeah, that's really good. And one thing that occurs to me as I hear you talk about that is um, the person that can answer it best is the person who's close, but maybe they're not even asked. Maybe
Right.
no one ever asked them.
Yeah. Yeah. The
Right.
craziest thing for me was often to go down the manufacturing floor, and one of my questions was usually, "What are you thinking?" And you'd be surprised at how many times I got back, "I'm not paid to think."
Yeah.
And it would
Yeah.
just blow me away because it's the furthest thing from the truth, right? But it's because cultures tend to lead people that way because they don't listen or they don't ask,
Hmm. Yeah.
right? And so
Yeah.
so being able to change that, right? Everybody that comes into the organization is paid to think,
Yeah.
right? maybe it's not the same level. I
Hmm.
haven't really thought into that much, but they're definitely paid to think about their job and how, because again, like we talked about early on, right, is we all have one goal, right, for the
Hmm.
company is that's to build and grow the company.
Yeah, yeah. And you think about it, like you climbed inside of the, what was the thing you said you climbed
Yeah, it was a
inside?
grain bin or
You
I
climbed
was
inside of the bin because you had
yeah,
to get a better look at the thing, right? You couldn't,
right,
you wouldn't know it from outside. You had to go inside to look at it, right?
exactly.
And I think it's the same concept. Like, how do we know from up here what's going on down on the floor? It's the people on the floor that can see it that we in ways we can't, all right? So,
Right, right. And I think
yeah.
it comes back to the Dale Carnegie principle, right? Walk a mile in my shoes, right?
Uh-huh.
Put yourself in the other person's shoes and understand from their perspective. Because so many times we look at that from ours, and I can be that way too. I mean, I remember vividly being in a meeting and we were talking about a process, and I was just getting this knot in my stomach,
Uh-huh.
right? And I started to think, let me take a pause here. Why am I getting this knot? I was thinking all the resources it was going to take to support this from engineering, right? But
Uh-huh.
that wasn't the purpose of the meeting. The purpose of the meeting was we're defining the process.
Right, right.
After we defined a good process, then we needed to talk about how are we going to staff this. What are we not going to do? What are we going to do? That kind of a thing. But so many times we can get caught up in from our perspective of what does
Uh-huh.
this look like.
Yeah.
And I think being able to let go of that and put ourselves in the other person's shoes, or let go of that hat
Mm.
and think about it as we're working on this for the organization, not for my department.
Yeah. Very good. Well, so people don't have to be in the state of Iowa to work with you, right?
Correct.
Yeah. So, and you could really, you don't have a set service area, do you? I mean, you could pretty
I
much
don't. Yeah,
you're doing
mainly
some
probably
virtual.
the continental United States, but
Yeah. Yeah.
I like to travel internationally occasionally too. But
Yeah. 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 And definitely would. Yeah. And so, I think that's a good point that people, I mean, certainly wherever this goes, people will have the opportunity to have all the links to connect to you and
fantastic.
and and do that, but also you know the work that you do can be both virtual and on site and maybe a combination
Right.
thereof, right?
Yep.
Yeah. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Excellent. Well, listen, I appreciate so much that you've taken some time to have this conversation with me here on the podcast, and definitely just beyond that, I'm thankful to know you and appreciate the opportunities that we've had to be involved in things together and part of different communities together as well. So
Yeah.
thank you
Thanks,
so
Rick.
much
I
for
really
that.
appreciate the opportunity. It's a great conversation. Always love
Okay.
talking with you.
All right. Bye for now.
Yep. Take care.